turn this off and show you guys. So after a little bit of sanding, I wanted to show you just the how-to. So that was a few minutes, call it 2 minutes of sanding. This is the black gel coat that I sanded with 80 grit. And you can see I went through to the resin here. That's okay. Remember, I left it a little long. We'll be trimming this at the end. But you can see there's a little bit of shiny spot right there. So that's a low spot. See this here? I wanted to show you. There you go. That gets better angle. So if you see areas that are not sanded, like right there and right there, right here, I haven't really sanded into the gel coat. The gel coat is thick enough where you might not even need body filler. Here's one I lightly scratched. There's a low spot there. Fiberglass shrinks a little bit, but you can see I can actually sand out a lot of the low spots on this panel for the rear of the Beetle just with the gel coat. Now if I sand down and I start seeing fiberglass, you know, the bare resin like this, if I start seeing fiberglass around a low spot, like on the perimeter, it means I really can't go much further because the fiberglass doesn't sand as easy as the gel coat, and you'll just be digging a hole in it and not really doing much. You can do it a little bit, but not much. So if I get this and I start seeing resin, I stop. I'll throw a little skin coat of Bondo on there. The 2K primer probably would fill that, but why not, right? Just sand it with the air file or by hand, scuff that really well, and then put just one little swipe of Bondo on some of those lows, if you see them after. I'm pretty confident I can take those lows right there out with the gel coat. So that's it. That's how you prep the fiberglass. The next stage after this is to spray the 2K primer. I'll lightly sand this with 220, and then I'll do the 2K primer all around. And make sure, don't leave any shiny spots. Anything shiny won't, the paint won't adhere to it. So you want to make sure that even if it looks good and there wasn't much work to be done, make sure you scuff every inch of your panel. Okay, this is the last view you'll get. I just used the air board. I used this air board at 80 grit, and I sanded back and forth, and it all looks great, right? Well, and by the way, use a clean rag. You've got a nice surface here with no oils, no contamination. Use a clean rag to de-dust, and I'll wipe all this off so you can see what's underneath. Now this is mostly still original black gel coat underneath, and I just want to show you. I'm going to be priming this with the 2K primer. There we go. There's a nice piece. Now I'm going to pre-fit this on the car. Sanded the edges. And you can see I got most of those lows out. Just barely went into the fiberglass. No worries. I'll have to scuff some of this. I'm going to Bondo this a little bit. So I'll use real rough sandpaper. I'll sand this down. So even that little tiny area there, anything shiny that looks like it wasn't sanded, you have to manually sand. Just take a little sandpaper and scuff it up so that you don't have adhesion problems. I can still get that out of the, here's one here. See that shiny spot? I can sand that down. I'm going to let the 2K primer fill some of these really light low spots just because we put it on pretty heavy. So there you go. I'm going to spray this next. This one's ready to spray. And then we'll let that kick overnight, and tomorrow when I block this down, this is one of the better panels in the car. This one and the rear surround up there are in very good shape, and they only really require sanding and priming. The bed sides need a little more work just because they're more complicated. But there you go. There's your 80 grit sanded panel. Okay, so we went through the products that we use painting the car. The last video section, I was showing you how I 80 grit sanded with my airboard this entire piece. So I'm just doing one piece to show you the whole process. Even my cameraman Cooper has his carbon filtered mask on. You just don't want to breathe this stuff. You can tell. It really smells bad. It's bad for you. Don't breathe it in. So this is 80 grit. I wiped this down before I sprayed. Since there were a few defects, I left it 80 grit. Most of the times I sand it lightly 220 grit and then prime. But in this case, I know I'm going to put a heavy coat on. It's fiberglass. So I left it 80 grit. I'm going to use my old cruddy gun here from Harbor Freight, my $10 gun. You filter the stuff before you pour it in the gun. I'm mixing it 4-to-1. This is Nason Select Prime. It's a 2K primer. I already had it mixed from something else, so not to worry. And my measured graduated cup. And so even with this without the fumes, I'm going to use my mask. So I'll go 4-to-1, 4 parts primer to 1 part hardener, and then we'll pour it in here and spray. And I'll show you, without talking to all the mask on, I'll show you the spray pattern. Not so much an issue with the primer because you're putting so much on. You can have a bad spray pattern, you can have a crooked one. As long as you're getting the material down on the piece where you can then sand it later, you're in good shape. So here we go. Throw this to Okay, so the last bit, that gun I'm probably going to throw away. You can tell it was kind of a small spray pattern, but in general, you know, that's it. I went a little heavy this time. I knew the areas where I needed a little extra primer. Normally, if I was someone doing this for the first time, I would cover it in gray, I would let it sit for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I would take a look at it and give it 2 or 3 coats, giving 10, 15 minutes in between, just to make sure you're not over, coating one area. I purposefully went around the perimeter, if you saw that, laying on a little extra because there were a few little defects that I know the primer will fill. And then this will cure overnight. The catalyzed primer, remember, it's got the hardener in it. It's not quite as good as the polyester primers, which are liquid Bondo. But these urethane primers, they're catalyzed, they turn solid on their own. If you seal the cup the next day, it's going to be solid in there. So you don't need to air dry. Best of both worlds. It air dries and cures. So tomorrow, I'll block this by hand. I'm not going to 80 grit this. I'll use my 220 grit sandpaper and I'll sand this really smooth. And believe it or not, I'll probably have to spray a couple of little areas with more primer. I'll probably blow through the primer into the gel coat in a few little spots. But really, if I'm really careful, I could actually base coat and clear this thing tomorrow morning. And remember, the other reason I could lay it on thick is it's in a horizontal plane, right? I mean, flat things don't drip. Whereas if this thing was on a car this way, there's no way I would have put it on that thick because it would have dripped, right? I would have done 3 or 4 light coats, made sure it didn't drip, and then painted it. So tomorrow we'll shoot this and show you what the paint and the clear coat looks like. That's the next segment.